On tonight's episode of the Change Mode, we talk about render, react, require, flux, and more. We learn a lot and we have a lot of fun. You're not going to want to miss this. Stay tuned. This is Change Mode, episode number 7, recorded July 31st, 2014. Is 2014 the year of isomorphism on the JavaScript? Welcome to Change Mode, episode number 7. Today we are going to talk about isomorphic JavaScript. And what does that even mean, you might ask? Well, you'll have to wait until after I remind you some stuff. So, just a reminder, coffeeandbeer.tv is where you can find this show and the wonderful Don't Panic, of which we are both cast members? Hosts? Hosts. I guess cast members would be weird. Hosts. Yeah. Subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher, or the RSS feed on coffeeandbeer.tv/changemode. And feel free to tweet live during the show using hashtag ChangeModeShow. All one word, stuck together, no camel case. So, speaking of hashtags, you use IRC, right, Colby? You've used this.
Yeah, bro.
Before. Yeah, like programmers, they just, for whatever reason, we are oftentimes partial to old, clunky technologies that just work. Linux. Not so much Windows, but, you know, things like that. HTTP is a good example. TCP, still going pretty strong. So IRC is this old chat system back from the 80s, or maybe even earlier. Anyways, this is like the domain of programmers now. It's like only we use it. And that's probably not true, but the only people I know of who use IRC are gamers and programmers, actually. But recently at work, there's been this huge initiative to get the entire company using the same chat system. And of course, this is kind of a miracle that this occurred this way. But rather than use HipChat or any of the other ones, we decided that everyone's just going to use IRC. So we built this whole web interface, and it's really, everything works great. It's integrated with the staff directory, so you can see everyone's profiles and what teams they're on and what projects they're working on just by hovering over their stuff. And there's crazy inlining of images and YouTube videos and Etsy links, Amazon links. It's pretty legit. Actually, it's open source called something. I'll find it later. Anyways, I noticed a terrifying phenomenon. Guess what most people now call channels in IRC?
Hashtags?
Hashtags. Hashtag marketing. It makes sense, right? You're talking about marketing, just like on Twitter, you just filter by marketing. Hashtag marketing.
I don't know. No one where I work says that. I think they all say pound. It's like poundy.
But don't
like
non-engineers at Facebook use Facebook Messenger? I imagine? Right.
Yeah, I guess, to be honest, like most inter-company communication is done over Messenger with like some like very specific things that happen in IRC.
Gotcha. Well, anyways, enough of that. Isomorphic JavaScript. That is a word. Colby, what is isomorphic JavaScript? And if you get stuck, I found a definition for you, and I put it in the rundown.
Nice. So I think this is actually pretty easy to talk about. It's like, I mean, the basic idea is that you have one version of your web application written in JavaScript that can run both on the server and on the client in a web browser. So the idea being that you don't have to build your code twice. So you don't have to write, your view in PHP in some like wacky templating language like Smarty or something.
Or like PHP.
Excellent point. And then go into JavaScript and like re-implement your template or in like Mustache and rewrite all your controllers to do like fancy client-side stuff. So the idea is that like you write your app once in JavaScript with with the same templating language and the same like data abstractions that are shared between the client and server. And then you have like you have one central API that can work either with the client or with the server. And then that's what you do.
So
It's as
what
easy
is
as
this? Is this API the central API that works on both the client and the server? How are you using API there? Is that an HTTP API? Is that another JavaScript library that happens to also be isomorphic insofar as that data access library runs on the client and the server?
I guess it doesn't really matter, right? Like it could be HTTP. Like you can make web requests from the client and from the server. It could really be anything you want. Like, but yeah, like theoretically, it would be itself isomorphic and shared between the client and the server.
So,
I think
one problem I can imagine coming up is that I'll explain a little bit about where I was coming from with this. So I worked on a project. I hacked something together in 8 hours that was rendering pages in Node, but using all the other regular stuff my company has on the back end. And it turns out that most websites these days have this pretty sweet API that public developers can use, mobile apps can use. And if you could build a page just using your public API, then you could render it, you could have Node call that, and everything's great. But wouldn't you use different libraries on the client to call those HTTP endpoints than you would on the server? So would you run jQuery Ajax on Node?
Oh. I mean, you could. You probably
could. I don't know.
I don't see why not.
Okay.
I mean,
that's weird.
I guess like that would probably be something that it would make sense to like abstract away, right? Like you could have a top level like data access layer, right? And then how that layer actually fetches the data could certainly be an implementation detail that varies on the client or the server. So,
but if you're running the same code on the client and the server, how does that access layer determine how to access the data? How does it know what's running on the client or the server?
I don't know. You'd have to tell it, right?
Good night.
It's like obviously like a server running Node.js is different than a browser running,
right. Well, okay.
Like,
I'm
at some point you're gonna have to make a distinction.
Don't you do like if document.window type? We ended up doing like if type of document.window, then you're on the browser, else you're on the server. I think another thing you can do is if type of path or something, and if path is defined, then that means you're in Node. But there are ways.
That seems reasonable. Then again, though, like, right. There are ways, like, ideally you wouldn't want to ship your server-specific code down to the browser.
Interesting. How would you avoid doing that?
I mean, I guess you could have like, so your browser assets are at some point going to be like packaged up. Like you won't be running the same, like physically the same JavaScript on the browser that you are in Node. Like the Node JavaScript will live like in files on disk somewhere in like your JavaScript will be like Clojure compiled and like minified and packaged, and like on a CDN somewhere. So like as probably the I think what makes the most sense is like as part of your packaging where you minify your JS and like it's like concatenate your scripts and things. Mm-hmm. I think it would make sense to strip out server specific code that you might not want to expose to the entire world.
So would you detect those checks? Like, would you have logic in your build pipeline that says, for all of the stuff underneath this, if not browser check, just rip it out if we're packaging for the client? There's not like a smarter way to do that? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, you could do something like that, right? That's I think in practice that ends up being pretty easy to do if you use like a common flag that is set to false. Like Clojure compiler will strip it out because it's an unreachable code path.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So that's like just like kind of a clever way to do it. You could also, you could get even clever. You could have like, you could probably do it on your. I assume this is something we're gonna get into in a little bit, but
no reason we can't get into it now.
Right. So Node uses the common JS module system for like requiring different modules within JavaScript. So
which is kind of like just to give a analogy, it's like include in Ruby or PHP. Just get a source file and append it into my thing here.
Right. So to actually share code with Node in the browser, you need some sort of like module system that works in both. So however you go about doing that, you could certainly build something into at the module level that lets you like have a server version of a module and a client version of a certain module that
I see. Right. So
I know Browserify, which is a pretty popular common JS system. It's like a build system that implements common JS modules, which is what Node uses in the browser. I know. So they do. They're called shims, I think. So it's like wrappers around certain Node utilities that don't exist in the browser.
Stubs is how I would describe that. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. But something like that you could certainly do it at the like module loading level, or I think that like in the perfect world, if you have time, well, maybe not the perfect world. I think in the perfect world, everything would just work everywhere with no effort.
So that means everything would be written in JavaScript then?
Yes.
Well, we're getting to your perfect world. Common JS is a way of requiring files, JavaScript files.
Correct.
But that's a Node specific thing?
It's not Node specific. I think there are two. There are probably more, but there are two mainstream specifications for requiring for like modules and requiring.
And by specification, you mean an interface for requiring them and an interface that the files being required must adhere to.
Yeah, correct. Because that is not something that JavaScript itself has. At least that may not be the case for like ES6
we have
or something.
Script tags in the DOM. What's wrong with that?
We do have script tags in the DOM. Nothing to a certain point. Global state is what's wrong with that.
Right. So common JS. Two main streams of how to do this.
The two mainstream ones are CommonJS and AMD, which I think it stands for asynchronous module definitions. So CommonJS is what Node uses. For using CommonJS on the client side, you have things like, so Browserify is a good one, or I don't know if it's good. It's the one I've used, because I prefer CommonJS because it is nicer looking. It is also more magic-y. So with CommonJS, you absolutely have to have like a build step which processes your JS and like transforms them into like this other source. The alternative is AMD, which is less magic-y and consequently more verbose. But in AMD, you do the transformation instead of having a transformation step. You literally just like write it out. You basically write out this define block and wrap your entire module in a closure.
And what is require.js? And how does
require.js is an AMD loading system.
Okay.
So one of the things that's nice about AMD is it's like, one, it's easy to get started, and it's a lot easier to wrap your head around. If you haven't like thought about this before, because like I said, there's no magic. There's magic, but
we're talking about JavaScript here, folks.
Yeah,
the fact that you can have scope at all is magic.
Right. There's no like build step magic. You can write AMD modules and like and use them without Node.js.
Okay.
Which is cool. So that AMD, the first module system I ever used was AMD. I don't know, Dan, if you remember our
disaster of a backbone app.
Yeah, we use require.js for that, for software development.
Capping software engineering, software development. I think it was software development. Yeah. That was a disaster.
It was a disaster,
and that was a backbone problem, right?
Well, I mean, it was a backbone problem. It was really an us problem.
A problem exists between keyboard and chair problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
These guys have no idea what they're doing problem.
I mean, you could argue that it was a backbone problem in that Backbone should have like some sort of convention for preventing you from getting yourself into a bind like that. But
which, if I understand correctly, and now we're getting off track, but if I understand correctly, Marionette offers that convention for not shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, so Marionette is like, I'm not particularly familiar with it, but from what I understand, it is a sort of framework built on top of Backbone,
right?
That has much more robust like view handling stuff.
Cool.
Which helps you not do what we did and rewrite your semester-long project in Rails in one night.
Although that does make for a good story.
It does.
Speaking of shooting yourself in the foot, while I was prototyping this, the person I was prototyping it with, we started talking about exactly this, shooting yourself in the foot. And there was a younger, I'm 23, 24, 24, 23. There we go. So younger is not that much younger. But there was a younger person there, newer in the field. And he's like, what are you talking about? Like shooting yourself in the foot. And then we were like, well, actually, you're always shooting yourself in the foot. But you don't want to keep shooting yourself in the same foot until you blow the foot right off. You kind of just want to graze it a little bit. And while that wound is healing, you don't want to shoot too much more at that one. You just kind of, so you can keep walking. Even it'll be painful, but better to have 2 painful feet than only 1 foot at all. That was a terrible analogy that went way off the rails. No pun intended. Anyways,
It's gone too far.
so we've got this isomorphic JavaScript. It runs on the client and the server. Requiring files is super important because, as you pointed out, when you're requiring files on the server, you're requiring like /assets/js/myprofile/bootstrap.js or whatever it is. When you're in the browser, you have to jump through a little more hoops to require that JS that might be inlined somewhere in some crazy part of the DOM or whatever it is. I actually have no idea how that works, but it does. One thing you mentioned that I'd be interested to hear what your opinion is that you mentioned a couple times that your entire app would be in Node. But I think we're both in situations where our entire apps that we work on our day jobs are not in Node, but this still seems to work. How is that happening? Like, what's the division of labor between your PHP or your Rails or whatever it is, and then Node, and then the client?
I see. So, well, at my work, we don't have that division at all. We're not sharing JavaScript.
But Instagram does, right?
Yeah, and I don't. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, maybe. I don't. To be honest, I'm not sure. I don't know anything
the
about
Pete Hunt
Instagram.
interview seemed to indicate that one of the design tenets of React is everything I've read is that it's for sharing views on the client and server.
Yeah,
we haven't even talked.
To
about
be honest,
it yet,
I think it ended up being an added bonus just because of the way it serializes the DOM and the way it like if you've ever used React and inspected the DOM, there are all these crazy like data attributes with these long ass like identifier strings, and the way it uses those identifier strings, it can take a React rendered DOM tree and like rebuild the React nodes from it,
right?
And like, which is cool. So, it's really cool.
So let's talk about React then. So in my research on this, there's some libraries for constructing views. That's not even true. For building a DOM, and Backbone has this with Backbone views. React has this, and that's like one part. And then there's the backend model part, which is largely not that cool if you're not running your entire app in Node, except for the fact that you can then bind these models to views. They're called React components, I think, or regions. One of them is called regions. Anyways, the idea, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the idea is that you have these JavaScript models on the client and the server, and you can push changes from them to their constituent views, and views can initiate actions that also change those models, which could then change other views dependent on that data. How much of that was a lie?
That sounds about right. So one interest is this like, so we're getting into kind of talking about like the Flux and dispatch.
Maybe
stuff,
I didn't look into Flux at all. That's like the unidirectional render thing.
Correct. Okay. So yep. React is so you think of Backbone as an MVC framework, right? Model, view, and controller. React is just the V. So all React does is render views.
Right. It's not a Backbone equivalent or at all.
No, right. It's like the V in Backbone. You can literally use Backbone and React by just, instead of using Backbone views, just render them with React.
Yep.
So, all right, where do I want to go? That makes it really useful because you can use it like however you want. So if you buy into the React way of doing views and like letting its kind of DOM diffing engine like render your HTML for you.
Mm-hmm.
You can use it with pretty much anything. So you could use it in a Backbone app. It's super easy. I've done that before, and it feels really good because the view, referring back to our aforementioned disaster of a software development project,
Right.
the view part was where we screwed ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes that really easy because it makes things like cleaning up listeners. You don't have to do that anymore. Like intelligently updating your DOM, like you don't do that anymore. It's declarative. So you say what you basically write out what it should look like, and it looks like that. It's almost magic. So so you could use it in Backbone. You could use it in anything else. There is a Facebook preferred. Well, I don't know if it's preferred. The people who have been working heavily with React have done a lot of thinking about like how to actually do data with this sort of thing. And one of the things they've sort of like their tagline for this stuff is kind of that MVC doesn't scale. So
on the client, I mean, there's plenty
Yes.
of arguments about MVC being just a stupid pattern.
Yeah, right. MVC in JavaScript on the client doesn't scale, because you like if you've ever done like so one of the things you generally end up with in MVC, and this is exactly what happened to us in our software development project. You have views. You end up with a view that updates a model, and the model notifies other views of the changes to the model, which updates those views, which updates the model, which notifies all those same views. And you get yourself into these maddening, like just insane loops of terror and sadness. And it's horrible, and you don't know what's wrong, and you don't know how this happened, and you start questioning your life decisions and your choice of major and all that good stuff.
And your choice of language, and then you just switch away from the entire thing. Yeah, you just give up.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So basically, what they've come up with is a system called, they're calling it Flux. But you can read about this online. They gave a talk at F8 about it. But the idea is that it's unidirectional data flow. So it's all about like, the idea is like once your web app reaches a certain scale, it becomes all about like data flowing through the application. So on Facebook,
so in the presentation, they talked about the chat window. They described the implementation of the chat tab.
Right. So the chat tab is like the canonical example of like where this will change your life, right? So, if you think of the Facebook desktop page, you have the chat bar on the side, you have the messages, the little chat tabs on the bottom, and then there's the messages jewel up top. And if you're on the messages page, there are all your conversations inline on the messages page.
In addition to all those other things. Oh, except the sidebar. But you still have the jewel to worry about. And I think no, maybe not tabs. But you have like the side things there.
The chat tabs stay there when you're on the messages view.
Oh, shit.
Unless that's changed very recently. So it gets crazy. And like for a long time, there would every like 2 or 3 weeks, there was this bug where your messages jewel would show one unread message, and you would click it, and there wouldn't be a message there. Mm-hmm. And it made everyone sad.
I still feel like this happens, probably because every time I see one, I just assume it's not there. I've been trained.
Yeah, and every couple weeks, somebody would fix it, and then a couple weeks later, it'd be back again, and it was just hard. And I don't mean I was not the one fixing this. This was like before my time at Facebook, for better or worse. Maybe it's for better. But so out of this, they decided they were thinking about like what was the problem here, and they came up with is that the problem was that there was one view, be it the chat tab or something, that would the user would interact with it. So you click on your chat tab, which acknowledges that you've seen this message. So you see the message, and then the chat tab updates itself because it knows you've seen the message. And then the chat tab has to go notify like every other part of Facebook that needs to know that you've seen the message, that you
and
saw
you know
the
what
message.
you know what design pattern or what solid principle this goes against? I don't know if it's a solid principle, but I think we talked about this before, or at least I think about it all the time. A code smell, we probably talked about this with Bob. A code smell is when any single piece of code has a direct reference to another piece of code. So I imagine that the chat tab had direct references to all these other places, which meant that anytime you changed any one of those things or added a new thing or modified the way this reading worked, you had to change it in every place because you could read things now in multiple places. The data and the behavior is distributed.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, if I had to guess, it probably didn't have a direct reference, but it was using a very loose like event broadcasting system. And the problem the problem would be that like, you could have race conditions between like the user doing something and responses from the server. So like the Joule might get a notification from the server before the chat tab did. And like obviously like one interface would get receive input from the user. So there was no way to synchronize that. So like if something, if the server and user interactions were out of sync across the different UIs, they would all become out of sync, which was sad times. So basically what they came up with is this unidirectional data flow. So in this sort of like flux world, your UI. Actually, I'm gonna step back again. So there's this thing in Flux called the dispatcher, and the dispatcher is basically a singleton like instance, and all data goes through the dispatcher no matter what. So your views update themselves based on events from the dispatcher. And like they can only update themselves based on the dispatcher. So this is the important thing. You can't have a view that at least in a purist world, you can't have a view that the user interacts with, it changes its own state and then notifies other things about the change of state. It has to, that view, when the user interacts with it, it has to notify the dispatcher that the data is changed and then wait for an event from the dispatcher to come back around to update itself. So what this gets you is, one, the dispatcher ensures you can't get into like an endless cycle of like updating views, right? So you can't have views that make other views update, because as soon as you try and like dispatch something from within a dispatch cycle, the dispatcher will throw an exception.
Interesting.
So saved your life right there, if nothing else. So the other thing you get is like it's easy to orchestrate like events from all over the place. So if you get updates from the server just pipes it into the dispatcher, and the dispatcher notifies all the views. So because it's a singleton, you have like one like global state for your entire website.
Right. So dispatches are they called dispatches or are they called events? Things that go into the dispatcher.
Let me look at the docs.
So while you're looking that up, whatever that's called, those can be triggered by events on the page, JavaScript events, or like server push state things. Like, is it some sort of WebSocket thing that's going on there?
It could be anything. That's an implementation detail.
Right,
you
right.
could be polling. It doesn't matter what.
Okay. Cool.
How the data is getting there. There could be some arbitrary new exciting like way to connect to servers. It could be like WebRTC or something.
Okay.
It doesn't matter, right?
I was gonna make a joke about how the methods of connecting to servers have seen a lot of innovation, but they actually have HTTP2 and Speedy and WebRTC. So never mind. That would have been a stupid joke. A stupid joke.
Jerk. Yeah. So I mean, that's the basic idea that all data flows one way through this dispatcher. Like it's a big circle, and everybody gets told about it like in succession.
It's the circle of life. The circle of JavaScript life.
Right. So like in practice, like not all data flow, like your views don't all subscribe to the dispatcher. You generally have your data like bucketed up into logical chunks, as you might in a database we call them stores generally. So if you're building like, I don't know, Facebook, for example, you know, you have a messages store, and like a user's store.
I might have missed that. Are these client side or server side concepts?
They're client side concepts.
Okay.
So that basically they serve the same function as kind of like a table in a database. It's just like logically dividing up your data, so it's not just one gigantic JSON blob.
That's called NoSQL.
I was gonna say, unless you're into MongoDB, and then I guess that's cool. But yeah, it ends up. It's like for writing, it feels like a lot of work when you're working on something simple. Like if you're doing the to-do list example, you're like, why did I just write, like 6 files to make a to-do list?
Right.
But once your to-do list, it lives on like 4 places in the same page. You bet your butt that you're going to be thankful you spent an extra 10 minutes writing out the store in the dispatcher for your to-do list.
So wait, you said the dispatcher for the to-do list? There is a global dispatch. There's not multiple dispatchers. It's not like the profile dispatcher is separate from the messages dispatcher, or is there?
There could be. It depends how it depends how you architected your system. I'm like talking out my butt here because I have no idea how it works. But I would imagine in Facebook there is a messages dispatcher that is responsible just for messages.
That in your mind would be separate from the dispatcher that updates like the client when you do the client side edit your profile thing. That would be okay. Gotcha.
Probably so.
And
that is again like a scale thing. Like Facebook has like thousands of developers and like dozens, if not hundreds, of teams working in their own chunks of the code. Mm-hmm. So it just pragmatically, like from a like programming standpoint or a performance standpoint, like if you had one dispatcher,
performance, they're the same thing. Yeah.
If you had one dispatcher that did literally everything, it would probably get kind of like slow.
Gotcha.
That is at Facebook scale of like things going on. I would imagine for most use cases, like one dispatcher would be totes fine.
Gotcha.
But again, that's like you can have more than one dispatcher. Each dispatcher is itself a singleton, and it probably, I don't know if it would be a good idea to have stores that subscribe to both dispatchers. I think that would be very bad.
Right. Because then you could introduce cyclical dependencies.
Right. So I think that's probably a good rule of thumb. Like if you have dependencies, if you're thinking about having two dispatchers and like one dispatcher has a dependency on the other dispatcher, then that means you should just have one dispatcher.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I in any case, I feel like that was a pretty.
So like you wouldn't have a stickers and a messages dispatcher. You would just have whatever you would call the umbrella term for that. Messages. Probably.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. So real quick, so we talked a lot about the client side specifically, and not so much like the isomorphic part of this, which is cool because I didn't know anything about that. So what I did this week that led me to propose this as a topic was we re-implemented Backbone, stupid Backbone, and stupid CommonJS on the server. So here was our goal. We want to share views on the client and the server because there's actually lots of opportunity to make things better on Etsy this way. So instead of reloading the whole page when you update your activity feed, we could have it scroll in or fly in or do something cool, and we could render all the cards. But if you hit it initially, we could load it on the server. You see a lot of websites doing this. Amazon just started doing it today in some experiments where they switch out the inner content. They keep the Chrome, and they just switch out the thing you're looking at or the search results. YouTube does this now where they switch out the video you're looking in without doing a full refresh. It's faster if you can do it right. It just, at the end of the day,
Facebook has been doing it for years.
Right. If you notice,
they've been doing it before it was cool.
Right. For a long time, the top part didn't reload. For years, the top bar doesn't reload when you go switch between what you would think of as different views. Like a photo view is different than a post view is different than a timeline view, but it's just doing an AJAX call to get the data and rendering the data on the client side. Unlike Facebook, however, we are in the SEO game. I now learned that I cannot say how much of our traffic is bots, but it is a shocking, almost cripplingly stupid large number. So this matters a lot. And what I mean by that is bots don't do JavaScript because they want to do things as fast as they can. They're not going to waste time running JavaScript, so they're just going to query your page and parse the HTML. So we have to always render a very full view of everything that we need for our Google juice all the time. So the way you do this is then at that point everything has to be in PHP. And if you want to do, for us at least, on the server, and if you want to do a client render, then you have to, as you alluded to earlier, maybe you could write, we're at this point now, maybe you could write the template in Mustache and you can share the template, but that's only maybe half the battle at most. What about all the logic that goes into like munging all your data into the right form so you iterate over the list the right way? What about that function you have in PHP that makes a URL for you, like a Facebook URL where the international subdomain is correct and the slug is localized, and by the way, we have all these security checks so you don't do something stupid, and by the way, we need to do the crazy security redirect thing for outside links. Where that's in PHP. It's not. So now you have that in PHP and JavaScript. The canonical example for us is money. You cannot render a price two different ways. You can't load a listing, and then go somewhere else, and then go back, do a magical client-side render, and then now the decimal place is off, or it's even if it's just spaced differently, people are weirdly attuned to this. The experiments show you can't mess that up. But if you want to do it that way, you have to have the implementation on the server and the client. So now it's twice as likely that you will mess it up, one way or the other. And there's ways you could do this, from simple things like we should just write unit tests for all of our formatters that call both implementations, and they should all pass the test. Which is like...
Just write unit tests.
Yeah. Which, again, that doesn't solve all problems. But it's better than not doing that. Or crazy things like compiling one to the other. Compiling your PHP to JavaScript or your JavaScript to PHP. Totally possible. Or you say, you know what? And this is what we tried to do. I mean, we succeeded, but it was an 8-hour project. It wasn't a full implementation. What if we say PHP is responsible for data fetch and returning that data, and that's it. Node is responsible for taking that data, formatting it, and rendering it. And if you write that code in an isomorphic way, you can render the same view on the server with the same formatting code as you do on the client. So your money function's the same, your formatting code is the same. You don't need to... Well, another implementation we had where it was separated meant that your PHP formatting code had to be separate from the template because the template has to be reused. But now your formatting code that is specific to that template, it's doing like crazy shit to that data to get it in the right form, is not next to your template. You have to like get like your C tags open and jump to that file, and now you have like a couple files open. You've got mustache template and the presenter and all these things, and it gets complicated fast, which is the price of abstraction. So it's really cool to be able to say, we don't need to worry about that, because in the Node world, we can have the best of both worlds. Our templates and our views can be closely bound. They don't need to be in separate files. They could literally be in the same file. You could, like, your string, you have like your template as a string, and then all of your view code right there, which is kind of awesome. We didn't do that, but you could. But they're tightly bound, and you can do the isomorphic thing, render on the client and the server. Super awesome. Do you have any questions for me, Colby?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe I do.
All right. If you do,
that all sounded terrifying.
Why?
I don't know. Just a lot to do. So much going on.
It is work. We're not. It's just so I'm not like anyone cares, but we're actually not saying we're doing this. We just did it,
messed around
and
with doing it,
tried to see what it would look like, and I think it looks better.
Yeah. I think it's cool. It's so. Maybe you said this and I like glazed over it. What is the like? So is the idea that your like the web request gets served to PHP, like hits PHP like fetches all the data it needs and then sends it to Node, or is it that the web request hits Node and Node gets all the data from PHP?
So we did not do this because we would need actual hardware to like figure this out, but we thought about it. This is what we think would happen. The web request would hit like Nginx or Apache Traffic Server. Those boxes have one Node instance running per core because Node is not multi-core. It's a single-threaded event loop. There are things you can do. I forget. There was a library mentioned that kind of forces Node to behave like PHP insofar as that it doesn't have global state and will kind of keep a local state for each request that it's serving. I think we would need something like that so we don't leak data across, because Node is long-lived, so we don't leak data across. So that would be a little bit tricky. But so requests would come in, hit Apache Traffic Server. Apache would hand it off to a Node. The Node instance would make a API call. So we also, and we will be talking about this at conferences soon, have this crazy API data fetch layer called Bespoke. And in your Bespoke endpoint in the server, you say, declaratively, this view requires a listing and take this get parameter and pass it in, or get this URL thing and pass it in. A listing, a user, which we also have from the cookie, user ID, get the user so we can render the header. Get the shop, but we can't get the shop until we get the listing back so we know what shop ID it is. So future on that. So you build out this dependency graph of stuff, and then the bespoke layer can ingeniously orchestrate these calls. So it'll optimistically do all the calls it can first, and then as it gets responses back, it will do the calls it now has data for. So as soon as it gets the listing back, it's going to call a shop endpoint because now it knows what the shop ID is. Whereas like related listings to a listing is keyed off of the listing ID, so we don't need to wait. We can get the related listings and the current listing at the same time. So that layer does all this data fetch and aggregates it and just sends the raw denormalized giant blob back to this node server, and the node server does all the formatting. It can synthesize new keys, delete things, munge them together, call formatting functions, all sorts of things, and renders it into a template and spits it back out. A cool design decision that we made that I was not entirely clear on, that I think relates to the React unidirectional thing, is we actually eschewed partials, template partials. So he's like, you know what? You can't do that in this design. You have to build out your view in like your top level view, and your top level view says, yes, much like the bespoke, I'm a view composed of these subviews, and these subviews take this data. So like the related listings takes an array of listings, and it only gets that. And that subview, the related listing subview, itself says, I am composed of 8 listing card views. I'm going to pass each of those listing card views the data for one listing. And then from the bottom of this tree up, we rendered. So we start with a JSON blob, and then slowly over time, the JSON blob turns from JSON into HTML fragments that then the top level thing gloms together into the final template and ships up. What that means is that all the sub-templates have no scope into anything above it, because we're using Mustache, and Mustache can do this crazy shit where if it doesn't find it in the current scope, it goes up. If it doesn't find it there, it goes up, until you have these crazy global objects that all these other templates are using, and you can't include a template because you don't know if you have the right global state, and it's just a mess. Whereas this kept it really nice, and I think it's kind of the unidirectional mindset. These templates do not talk to one another, do not share state. If you want to share state, you have to pass it in, and you're duplicating data, but that's fine. Memory is cheap for serving web requests. Like we're CPU bound at that point. We're just thousands of requests per second that we don't care how much memory it takes. So that was another cool property, I thought.
Yeah, that sounds very React-y. Like React components are like they're very much self-contained.
Right. So they call render on themselves, and the caller doesn't get anything except the result, the black box of that component back.
Yes.
Right. And I believe we were looking at React. Well, again, we like implemented a little bit of Backbone and some React and some CommonJS and just into this like 250 line thing, which is so cool. It was a lot of fun. I learned a lot.
Yeah. So the thing that makes React cool though is that while components are like black boxes, like their parents, they don't have any knowledge of their parents. You can nest components inside one another.
Right. So, yeah, that's what I was describing. So the listing view has this related listing subview, which itself is composed of 8 listing card subviews.
Right. Yeah.
So you just like for each listing for each element in this array, render listing card view with one of those things, and then you get an HTML fragment of 8 listing cards out of that.
Yeah. Nice.
So, is this where this is going? Is 2014 the future of isomorphic? The future. That's not what I'm trying to say. Is 2014 the year of isomorphic JavaScript? That's the question I hope so.
I'm tired of writing PHP. Let's be real. I mean, it's hard, right? This is not an easy problem. There's not an obvious solution, especially like if you're not starting from scratch. It's like if you're trying to work within the confines of like an established system.
From personal experience, moving towards a more and this is kind of a dirty word in system programming circles, and I can't even remember it right now. What do you call it when you don't have a monolithic app, but you have multiple service-oriented architecture? There we go. Moving towards a service-oriented architecture where your data access layer speaks HTTP. And much like a React subview, it has no knowledge of what's above it. It doesn't care. Right. And the other thing doesn't know it either. So it's just like, give me data, and you don't care what I do with it. I don't care how you got it. I don't care what language you're in. Makes this whole thing way more palatable. And I think that's becoming more of a kosher thing to do. Like, I think a lot fewer. You would probably still start out like this, but I don't think anyone would start out with like a Rails app or a PHP app and rule out the possibility that they would break that off into smaller pieces. Whereas a couple years ago, that was not something people did, and people kind of actively designed against it. Not consciously, but they didn't design for it. So like Facebook and Etsy, it's a giant pain to rip this stuff out. It's rewriting everything. It doesn't matter. Even if they're in the same language, the two services, you still have to rewrite everything.
Like the view, render, the presentation and the data fetching are very tightly coupled.
Which sucks.
Like very, very tightly coupled.
It sucks.
It's horrible. Yeah, it's terrible.
And you get the same problems coming from a backend perspective. When an errant data access call in a PHP template causes you make data access in a PHP template or in a Rails ERB template or whatever. When you're writing a big application, that write has serious ramifications, or read potentially. You're invalidating caches, you're going across the world, you're updating other people's views, you're updating models in memory. It's just a mess, and you end up with the same thing you described on the front end, where it's impossible to reason about what's happening. You're like looking at why a page is slow, and you're like, well, I just called like arrow user on this. It's like, yeah, but arrow user is like this weird under call magic that actually goes out to the database if the user isn't present, and you forgot to like memoize that, so you're going out every time like 15 times in a request to go get this. Like, no, we should get all the data declaratively, and then we're done. Just ship it out. The app doesn't need to do anything. The front-end developers shouldn't have to worry about whether they're making database calls and invalidating caches. Like, what? Talk about not separation of concerns. Rant off.
Yeah, I agree. It's madness.
I think Node is the perfect. So if you're going to do rendering as a service, Node was literally built for this. There are a lot of things Node is not good at and is rightfully given tons of shit for people using it for that. But taking in web requests and rendering HTML back and running some JavaScript while you do that is great. And also, I'll continue to plug what I think are the virtues of architecture, but talk to me in a year and we'll see where we're at. But because the Node thing is making API calls, and because of the way Node works, when it's waiting that 100 milliseconds for the API call to come back, it's doing other requests and making more API calls. So that 100 milliseconds is not lost. It's actually great because we're not doing that work. It can happen. Let's go take in some other requests, route them, and do some calls, and then we can render the templates and do the presentation logic as they come in. And we saw serious performance. I think we got 10 KOPS, 10,000 operations per second. I mean, it was a toy implementation, but the API was not a bottleneck at all, and that's built into how Node works.
Right. Yeah, it's cool. I mean, that's how JavaScript works, right?
Yeah.
It's like it wasn't new in Node.
Well, it's a novel
well,
idea.
I don't know.
Server
I'm sure it
languages.
wasn't new, but it was it was kind of novel. And like at least naively, it seems to be a pretty darn efficient way to do things in a single thread.
Right.
Like,
in a single thread. Yeah.
Yes.
But and in PHP world though, we're used to that model, so it doesn't feel icky to us to say, yeah, we'll just throw an Nginx in front of this, and we got 32 cores in this box. We'll just have 32 node instances. Who cares? And that now you're processing 32 or 64 or 32, 64, whatever. Processors are crazy. I thought 16 was like the max, and then I looked at some of our servers. I was like, wait, what? You can have 64 cores? Is what? Crazy.
wow.
Yeah, and free-m doesn't even make any sense
cores.
anymore. Like, I remember when I could read the megabytes in RAM and be like, oh yeah, that's like 4 gigs. Don't even try to do that with servers these days. And a free-t. Anyways.
Got you.
Yeah, I'm down. I want this to happen.
Yeah. And it is encouraging. Like, I don't think we mentioned it yet, but Airbnb does this already.
And Instagram. Right.
Yeah, and I guess Instagram. I don't know.
They claim.
Maybe. Do they?
I'm pretty sure they said.
Yeah,
that.
they claim to do it.
Because I think Instagram's
know,
thing is that a lot of their mobile views are web views.
Oh, interesting. I did not.
You've never had I don't think the feed is, but like your profile. Actually, you know what it definitely is that notifications thing where you get like, oh, so and so liked your photo. I've had like 404 Apache errors render in that thing.
Nice.
So I think they have a bare bones desktop client. So I think that's where their isomorphism comes in, is that they're rendering web views and desktop pages using the same code.
I see. That's cool. Yeah, so Airbnb, I think the first time I started thinking about this was when Airbnb wrote that blog post on what they were doing with Backbone and Node.
Right.
I think that was while we were still in school, right?
Yeah.
That was a while ago.
Well, it was November 11th, 2013. So no, actually.
Huh.
It might have been before that. They might have talked about it. The blog post I have, Isomorphic JavaScript, the future of web apps, was published on November 11th, 2013.
Is this the one where... So I think there might have been one before this where... Is this the one where they actually open source Render? So for Render is their framework for sharing JS between Node and the client.
Yeah.
2011?
Because
there was
maybe. So they actually have a history here. The first publish of this was by Nojitsu in 2011. Mojito is the first open source isomorphic framework published by Yahoo in April 2012. And then Meteor came out, which I haven't even talked about, which is like the the Apple. If Apple were to write an isomorphic JavaScript app framework that worked with nothing but was kind of perfect, that would be Meteor.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I forgot about Meteor. Yes, the Airbnb's original post wherever it was about Render. I remember they wrote a post basically talking about what they were working on. This was before they had actually open sourced Render. And I remember reading that and being like, "Oh my god,
yeah, the future."
I thought it was pretty great.
Totally, yeah. I remember having that same reaction.
Yeah, I mean it. Every time I think about, I would really love to start something from scratch.
Wouldn't we all?
Legacy code, man. There's so much of it, and so many people.
Every time you start a new project, you create more legacy code, Colby. Just think about it that way.
I know. That's true.
Because hopefully you're lucky and no one ever sees it.
Right. in some cases, like thousands of people. Well, I mean, every time you write code, you're creating
Right. That's what that's
code, right?
Yeah. That's what I meant.
Oh God. So I lately I've been coming across like things I wrote when I first started work, and more rarely, but even funnier, things I wrote while I was an intern, like 3 years ago now, that sort of blow my mind and make me feel bad about myself.
I know that feeling for sure.
What past Colby made future Colby's day harder.
Because you said it was when you were writing it. I'm sure you said, this is a future Colby problem. Let's let that asshole deal with it.
No, the problem was that like past Colby didn't even realize that it would be a problem. Had no idea.
Yeah, that's even worse.
He was just ignorant.
Yeah, I saw a comment that I wrote a couple weeks ago even that came back to bite me today. It was a terrible thing where I reached up into the PHP globals array and changed the server configuration at runtime. No. And there's a comment above it that says, "Really sorry about this, ... It's a long story.
At least you were apologizing to yourself and not like.
Well, no, you always imagine it's someone else.
You
like,
got fired.
I don't want so and so to come and see that I did this and think that I didn't feel bad about it. But actually, it will be you.
Maybe it's like karma.
Right.
Like every time you. Or maybe poetic justice is the thing I'm thinking about. When you do something terrible and you know it, but you're like, well, whatever. And then it ends up being you that has to fix it.
Right. All right. Well, I think that about wraps it up. We might be our longest episode ever. We'll have to see about that.
Really?
We're at an hour and 10.
When did we start?
So,
whoa.
Yeah. I don't know. We'll see. Stay tuned. Next week, we'll announce whether we actually, or next week. Yeah, so FYI, folks, I don't know when our next coffee and beer will be. It could be soon, but probably not. It'll probably
be our
be
next change mode.
Yes, our next change mode.
Yeah.
Bro.
Yeah, there is changes in the wind.
Yeah. Well, we'll say September. I am going. No.
What?
Oh, I'm going to do the Commonwealth tour of the UK. Speaking at a conference, which will be exciting. First time I'm speaking at a real conference. Colby is doing stuff. I don't know if Colby wants to talk about what he's doing.
Yep.
Colby will be busy.
Not quite
All right,
yet.
Colby will be busy.
But
he'll be visiting New York, and we'll be drinking and not doing.
Yeah. You're right. We're consciously not doing an episode next week because there's too much beer in New York City. Yes. I will say soon enough I will be drinking a lot more Dunkin' Donuts than I have in the past year.
What a tease! Wow. That you have to be a Dunkin' Donuts aficionado to read into that statement, though.
Yes. For better or worse.
Cool. So again, reminder as we wrap up: coffeeandbeer.tv. Subscribe on iTunes and Stitcher. We'll be back in September. Bright-eyed, bushy-tailed. Maybe I'll have a Scottish accent. That would be awesome. If I could do anything,
would be cool.
That would be it. I really want that. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you when we see you.
This show is brewed fresh weekly by the Coffee and Beer Podcast Network. Get all our shows at our website, coffeeandbeer.tv.